And I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, you are here for our webinar on mutual funds and inline XBRL compliance. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to walk through the agenda for today, tell you what we'll be covering. We're very excited to have with us today a number of great speakers who have a strong background in investment management and SEC reporting. We're going to start off first with a discussion with the SEC. And we have with us today Jacob Sandoval. Jacob is CFA, CPA. He is the branch chief at the Securities and Exchange Commission in the Division of Investment Management, Disclosure Review and Accounting Office. He's going to be joined by Guy Stanzione. Guy is Compliance Services Director at Topan Merrill. And they're going to lead us through a discussion a little bit about what was going on last year with the rollout of inline XBRL for mutual funds and what we might expect to see this year. We're then going to go on to the features of inline XBRL, focusing on things like hidden facts, duplicates, transformations, exclusions, continuations, dimensions, and we're going to talk a little bit about best practices. And that topic is going to be led by Steve Horowitz. Steve is Manager of Technical Services and Web Applications at NovaWorks, which is an XBRL US member. We'll then take a couple of CPE questions. So for those of you who are getting CPE for today's session, please make sure that you respond to the poll questions that you'll see up on the screen in front of you. Then the final piece of our presentation today is on reviewing inline XBRL. This is going to be led by Mike Boyle. Mike is XBRL Manager at Donnelley Financial Solutions, also a longstanding XBRL US member. And then finally, we'll take our last couple of CPE questions. So as we go through the presentation today, if you have any kind of technical issues, please email us at support@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. And if you have questions, again, as we go through the program, please click on the Q&A link on your console, and then you can type questions right in there, and we'll take them through the program. So with that, I'm going to move to our next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Guy Stanzione.
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. It's been an interesting year for a number of reasons, predominantly the transition to inline XBRL for the larger fund filers. Those of you with $1 billion in net assets or more fell under the requirements beginning last September. Today, we're focusing on and talking to the smaller fund companies, those that have less than $1 billion in net assets, those that will begin filing their 45 BPOSs after the September 17th deadline. So basically, any fund that has a May 31st fiscal year end and beyond will start filing an inline beginning this year. So anybody that has already had their annual update, so all of the April 30ths and prior, will not have to comply with inline until next year. They'll continue to do their traditional XBRL as they have been until the next annual update, which will happen next spring. So those of you get an extra year's of reprieve. But it has been, like I said, an interesting year related to the transition for the larger filers, the lessons we've learned over the past year. So I'm really excited about talking to Jacob about some of the issues that the larger filers have encountered, and just to give a heads up to the smaller filers, some best practices, as Michelle said, and ways to navigate the waters as we transition. Michelle, if you could change the slide, please. Jacob, if you don't mind, if you could spend a few minutes. Michelle gave a great summary of who you are, but if you could tell us a little bit about your role and your history at the SEC, that'd be great.
Absolutely, and welcome everyone. Before I get started with my remarks, I have to start with a disclaimer. The views that I express today are my own views and do not represent the views of the commission, the commissioners, or my colleagues on the staff. So with that out of the way, as you heard, my name is Jacob Sandoval. I'm a branch chief in the Division of Investment Management in our chief accountant's office. So I'm an accountant, not a lawyer. And so what we do, and the group that I manage, looks at fund financial statements and registration statements. And so in a given year, we review thousands of funds, and we are continually thinking about ways to review funds in efficient and effective manner. And the way that we do that is we oftentimes will utilize data such as XBRL data. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, is kind of my role and kind of how we utilize data. But that's what I do in my current role. Prior to joining the commission, I used to work at PwC's asset management practice. And I would like to add just another disclaimer is that I work with XBRL data, I utilize it. However, I have not, nor have I ever prepared XBRL data for submission. And so if there are any questions that come up, I would have to take it back or leverage the great resources on this panel with all the expertise here.
Thanks, Jacob. Perfect segue into your intro, Jacob. You're talking about the commission's use of the data, how it's being used, and certainly much different than the corporate finance world where the US GAAP taxonomy is way more extreme and way more detail oriented. Doesn't take away from the value of mutual fund reporting. If you can just give us a quick little update on how the commission's using the data today and any issues you might have seen as we transition to the next topics.
Yeah, sure. So I'm glad you asked this question. I think it's always super important to understand how this data is utilized. So just to understand the fruits of your labor, as it were. I think that many on this webinar understand that market participants utilize XBRL data. And so what I'd like to highlight here is how we on the staff at the commission utilize XBRL data. And specifically to investment funds, XBRL data can be utilized to better understand fee structures, performance, risks, returns. And so text analysis, for example, can be performed on the data, which can provide insights into those disclosed risks and strategies. And I'd like to say it's important to identify issues around reported fees and performance. And oftentimes we utilize this data that is data tagged and aggregated to perform that analysis. One way to think about how the Division of Investment Management utilizes this data through identification of issues is that we leverage it to analyze the registration statement. Not only the registration statement just for a particular fund, but across a fund complex. And we will create publications highlighting certain findings. One publication that I did want to mention here is an accounting and disclosure information statement, and that is ADI 2019-09. And so what that highlights is fee and performance issues that we've seen on registration statement filings. This ADA highlights certain items such as performance presentations that failed to disclose sales loads, incorrectly showing net versus gross return expenses, failing to disclose acquired fund fees and expenses, or failing to correctly calculate the hypothetical expenses that are required. So a lot of this identification is utilized when XBRL data is aggregated because certain calculations and checks can be performed to understand if what is reported on the registration statement is accurate across the fund complex. In addition, this information can be compared to other data sets. And so as a quick example, the XBRL data, which would have the acquired fund fees and expenses, can be compared and checked across another form type, which is Form Import, which has actual acquired funds. And so it can be evaluated and flagged if there are inconsistencies. So wanted to highlight that ADI 2019-09, because it's valuable to understand issues and inconsistencies that can be identified using various tools, including this XBRL data. And given enough data, many evaluations can be performed. And so it's something that is continually evaluated and refined. So you also asked if we've seen any issues with what's being reported. I'd like to say that we haven't seen any pervasive issues with the information reported. However, there are occasional reporting hiccups or errors. I think in the past we've seen transposition errors or incorrect tags utilized. And for transparency, anyone could take a look at the aggregated XBRL data for mutual funds. That is actually on the SEC's website. And so if you go to sec.gov under a section titled "We Provide Data," anyone could pull this information that's aggregated on a quarterly basis and published. And so when it's on a quarterly basis, you could see what's out there. And you can see what tags are utilized by filers, even who is utilizing Inline versus those that are not. So wanted to encourage folks to check out the ADI 2019-09 to better understand reporting issues that have been identified in the registration statement, as well as the public data that is posted for mutual funds reporting XBRL.
That's great, Jacob. You know, I think a lot of people are glad to hear that because they've been wondering for the past 10 years maybe, gee, what's happening with my data? Where's it going? So the information you just provided is great. And I think that's really useful for all inline filers, not just the small group that's coming on board next month. So, you know, great information. Thank you.
No problem.
So we talked a little bit about it. In your opinion, how do you feel the first wave went? And we almost have a year under our belt. What have you seen as the challenges? What kind of feedback have you been getting from the filer community?
Great. So I can't speak specifically to challenges by particular fund groups, but high level, I would like to highlight that with any new requirement, implementation issues do arise, implementation issues and questions. There's two that I'd like to go over. One item that frequently came out around the rollout was submitting red lines in XBRL. And so this red line feature is also known as R tags. So because Edgar was in the process of being updated, it caused a bit of a delay in implementation. So filers instead would have to submit red lines as correspondence attached to the filing until filing agents were able to update their systems to make the submission of those filing red lines. So that was one item that came out. And so I think it was a combination of Edgar updates and then of course the filing agents also updating a lot of their systems. Mm-hmm. The other item that I did want to highlight was an interesting one related to class IDs. So the question that came up frequently was adding a new class to a 45B or a post-effective amendment because the class ID is unknown during the initial filing. So to address this question, the staff directed filers to utilize a dummy class ID that is different than the typical class ID structure for the first filing. This was not really an issue during the 15-day waiting period that we'll discuss later, because under the previous regime, the XBRL information, when the XBRL information was prepared, the class ID would have been known. So it's one of those nuances that comes up with a new rule. Most of these and other questions have been resolved. So folks should continue to refer to the Edgar Filer Manual or reach out to the staff should they have additional questions.
Great, thank you. You know, from our experiences, some of the things we talked about last week, some of the things that we've seen are with the elimination of the 15 business day grace period, change of workflows, change of behaviors that Mike and Steve are going to talk about in more detail. But one of the key features and one of the key functions, of course, is eliminating filings. One of the concerns that we had heard early on before XBRL is having to stop the editing process that much sooner is going to require us to do 497 filings. And in fact, we didn't experience that over the course of the past year. So the SEC's plan actually is working as intended, which is a good thing.
That's good to hear.
But one of the things that we have worked with, and you're going to hear, like I said, Mike and Steve talk about it in more detail, is working with our filers to focus on specific pieces of content. For example, work on the risk return summary first, get that content updated, have your reviewers look at that, begin tagging while the rest of your content is being edited, reviewed, and getting ready to file. And that's one of the lessons learned that we experienced and tried to share with our filers over the past year. Which brings us into the next topic, tagging, and some of the issues that we've run into with hidden facts, when they're appropriate, when we're seeing it, are they acceptable, should we be concerned?
Great. And so I think one item that I'd like to highlight is the bar charts. So bar charts, for example, is often a hidden fact is associated with that item. And so that actually is highlighted in the Edgar Filer manual. And so I happened to write it down because I knew the question in advance, but just to give everyone the section within the Edgar Filer manual, it's 5.2.5.15. And the title is Bar Charts in Risk Return Summary Information. Basically, that section highlights that annual return facts are still required, but may appear in the IX hidden section. There are other areas, but bar charts are probably the most common area. I think we're gonna, later in the presentation, we'll probably go over a couple of other areas. And so I, again, just want to refer folks to the Edgar Filer manual, as it can be very helpful related to hidden facts, because for investment companies, there are certain hidden facts that generally would be expected. I would say that if there are a significant amount of warnings that you're seeing, or you do have any questions or significant issues, you could always reach out to the staff. The folks that deal with a lot of those questions are very responsive if you just email structureddata@sec.gov.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that we've seen with hidden facts is the way that the content, the document is being prepared. Just an example, we know the bar chart is an image. The best worst quarter, usually that's part of the actual HTML document, but sometimes it's included in the performance bar chart, which makes that part of the image, which would generate a hinted fact wording when you tag that content. So that's one of the things that we've experienced over the year, and where it brings up warnings, and filers have to make the decision how they want to manage and create their content. Great. We talked a little bit about this. Now you get a chance to talk about it in a little bit more detail. The 15 business day period, the grace period, as we called it, that was eliminated with Inline. What do you think the impact will be? The larger filers certainly might have more resources than the smaller filers, but how do you see this moving forward for the next wave?
So this is something that has been highlighted. It was a big impact. So it was a large change, as you mentioned, in workflow. The elimination of the 15-day waiting period it greatly impacted those workflows, these interactions with filing agents or vendors. I think it's always good to bring it back to the adopting release and point out that the waiting period was carefully considered and evaluated. The adopting release goes into several pages of commentary with respect to this change. And so it just goes to highlight that the commission didn't take this change lightly. I think taking the considerations from members and then choosing the best path forward for market participants and investors. And I think it particularly impacted 497 filings, because often these filings are made when there's an update to a registration statement for risk language, changes in strategies. And this change may occur outside of your typical cycle. And so annual update done on a 485B, well, if there's a change during the year, let's see a 497. So the change in workflow, is greatly impacted in those 497s. But I would like to highlight a lot of the benefits of, Inline, because it does make the data more current and available to industry, particularly when that 497 is filed. So the timeliness can increase the usefulness of the information to users of XBRL data. It increases the ability to spot issues because there's no lag in the data. It may also reduce data errors because it doesn't need to be transcribed from one document to another. So that there are benefits. I would point out that, I think that it was highlighted around the changes in workflow and those interactions within the organization, and then also with third parties. But it was something that was carefully considered. And I know everyone's busy, but it is always good sometimes to kind of break it back to the adopting release and kind of think through the commission's thought process upon the adoption.
Right. Thank you. And what we as a group would always suggest is to talk to your service provider, your filing agent, about best practices and change in workflow and how it'll make it easier for you guys to adopt to Inline. And it also will minimize the number of potential 497 filings that happen within that 5-day period that you would typically see after a 485B files. Certainly any updates throughout the year, that falls outside the scope of this conversation. But for those immediately at the effective date, that's the feedback and the best practices and advice we give to people. I'll lead this last statement. This next question, I'm sorry, with a statement. We have not seen any of our smaller fund clients adopt earlier than necessary. Jacob, what is your experience and what is the commission seen related to smaller filers?
So I'm glad you asked this question. We have seen early adopters, and so utilizing inline XBRL tagging. Anyone can utilize the currently published, I think, XBRL data to identify some of those funds and practices. That's why I keep bringing it back to some of the information that is posted on the website, because I do think it's super useful to understand practices, not only on some of the aspects of tagging, but also around just kind of where folks are on implementation. And so I also wanted to bring it back to, I think the question that's on the slide also speaks to just some of the challenges. Can't speak to, I guess, particular challenges for specific funds, but with any adoption, I think it comes down largely to planning and communication, to your point earlier. So early communication internally with legal, the vendors, those responsible for the filing internally, or just through a filing agent or vendor, or even just with your investment optics to better understand it and help with a smooth transition. It's always important to think about communication, because there's going to be changes in workflow. It's going to be a different processes we'll kind of go through. And so I think that the commission also took this consideration into the thought process on the adoption, and actually change the phase-in period. If you look in the adopting release, this speaks to the phase-in period for large funds and smaller funds. So hopefully that change gave ample time for everybody to prepare and make adjustments necessary during this period.
Thank you. Last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Steve. What would you say the top takeaways? What would be the best advice you would share with the smaller group, the phase 2 filers?
I would say the top takeaways for me, I do have 2 of them. One is the Edgar Filer Manual. And so use your resources that are available to you, the Edgar Filer Manual and the publicly available aggregated fund data. So these 2 resources can assist you as you think about your filings and compliance. The Edgar Filer Manual is a great resource and can shed light on common questions that do come up. And so I recommend bookmarking this resource if you're working on rendering or tagging the XBRL information for your organization. The publicly available aggregated XBRL data is helpful as well, as it can be leveraged to understand other filers' practices and how registrants are tagging certain data. And it's updated on a quarterly basis. So you're able to see the most updated information. And I would note that XBRL data is currently utilized by the commission to evaluate issues or detect outliers. So it's important to understand the data that's out there and how your data may be viewed in comparison to other filers as well. So I think that the takeaways are utilize your resources, those 2 resources in particular. They should be useful to the audience here in answering questions during this process.
And we completely agree. Staying in line with resources, bring in your human resources earlier, your reviewers, your approvers, focus on the risk return summaries, as we've been saying. And you can always continue to work on the SAIs, the Part Cs, the balance of the disclosure and the prospectuses. But if you focus on the risk returns earlier, get that content where you need it to be, get that piece of the prospectuses tagged, it'll cut down on all those issues that you were bringing up earlier, Jacob. So, that's, I think, fundamentally the lesson that we learned from the past year is plan, as you said, communicate, and bring your resources in as early as you can. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Jacob, this has been great. I can't thank you enough. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Horowitz.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Guy. So we're going to take it off now and talk a little bit about Inline XBRL, what's changed with it, what's not changed, and some new features that Inline XBRL has over regular XBRL. So one of the biggest changes you're going to notice immediately is the instance document. The INS file is no longer required to be submitted as a separate document. The Edgar system will actually suspend you if you try to do that, so you cannot have a separate instance document anymore. It's now embedded inside of your HTML file, which is your primary document. Traditional instance document is extracted from the iXBRL data, so you'll still see like an extracted XBRL instance file when you file your document, so you can still use your traditional reviewer tools to look at those files if you want to. Another big change is there is an Inline XBRL viewer that you can use to look at your document. I'm sure some of you have seen this already. You can just go ahead and use that to browse through your document, and Mike will be talking about that in more detail a little bit later. Some of the other things that have changed, there are some new features, hidden tags, which have been mentioned earlier, a big new feature. Transformations, which allow you to take data from one format and transform it into an acceptable format that XBRL can understand. We have exclusions and continuations, which are new ways to stitch data together. And I put dimensions on this list. They're not really changed, conceptually at least. The change is in how you review them. And that'll be something we talk about when we're talking about the viewer a little bit later with Mike. So with all these changes, then what is not changed? Well, you're still going to use the same company-specific extension taxonomy. So you still have the same custom elements. That's not changed. How custom elements work has not changed. You will still have your presentation link base and all your traditional link base files, like your label link base, cal, def, lab. All those are still required. The labeling requirements have not changed, so that's still going to be required to have in your file. And detailed data tagging is still required to the extent it has been. So you're still going to have to go and pick out individual detailed data elements like your best and worst quarter, for example. All previous calculation requirements are still in effect. I know there aren't too many with risk return filings, so that isn't too big of a challenge, but those are still in effect. So let's look at then some of the features of Inline XBRL. We are introducing hidden tags. These are a new feature. So hidden tags are used to include required facts in a way that doesn't require you to display them on the actual inline document. So this is generally used to tag data that isn't going to appear on your document, but is still required for technical reasons. So a great example of that is going to be your CIK. It's required to be inside of every document you file with Inline XBRL, but the CIK doesn't appear anywhere on the cover page of your document. So in order to actually tag your CIK, you're going to have to use a hidden fact to tag it. You can do two different ways of hidden tagging something. You could tag something so it's in the IX hidden section of your document and is only in the IX hidden section, such as the CIK, or you can tag something so it's in the IX hidden section and it points to a location in your document. For example, the bar chart, you could have that point to the actual image file if you wanted to. But in either case, those are going to be hidden facts that are in the IX hidden section of the document because they're not generally visible data. So when should filers avoid using hidden tags? Well, you don't want to intentionally hide data that should appear in your filing. If the data should be on the filing, it should be visible on the filing. And the Edgar Filer Manual does call out some elements of this, specifically for cover pages more often than not. But if the element is in the Edgar Filer Manual listed as required, it should be visible and tagged without a hidden fact. You also don't want to use hidden tags to tag information that shouldn't appear in the filing. So any extraneous information that might be on the filing that doesn't need to be tagged should not be tagged with hidden facts. And you want to avoid using them wherever you can. I mean, if a fact exists on the report and is visible, it should be tagged in a visible way. It might require some nudging or reformatting of the fact to get it to render correctly. But generally, if it's on the report, you can probably tag it using a transformation. So I think I already mentioned the best practices here, but yeah, you only want to use these tags, hidden tags, when it's absolutely necessary. And you only want to use it if something doesn't have a transformation to actually tag it. So if it's not possible to tag something without using a hidden fact, and the bar chart was a previously given example of this, you can't tag the bar chart without using hidden facts because it is a image. And right now, there's no way to tag data embedded inside of an image without using hidden facts. You also want to make sure you have a review process in place to review all of the hidden tags in your document. And you want to make sure that you review the reason why you're using a hidden tag, even if it's not supported elsewhere. In another way you could do it. So just make sure that you're aware why you're using these hidden facts. So the next feature introduced by Inline XBRL, we have continuations and exclusions. So these will allow you to include or exclude pieces of text from a document in non-numeric facts. And you might want to exclude things with this, like page breaks or images. So continuations are going to combine two separate pieces of the text and allow you to stitch them together into one fact. And exclusions will say, okay, I don't want this specific part of my document to appear anywhere in my filing. You would use continuations and exclusions, like I said, to remove pieces of these documents. You would use a continuation where two separate text blocks overlap, or text spans multiple pages with a page break in between them, or maybe if you have things inside of divisions with borders around the pages, you could use continuations to stitch those separate blocks of text together to make a single fact. You would use exclusions, though, if you're trying to just remove like a page break or an image from inside of your text block and you don't want it to appear in the rendered document. And you want to avoid using continuations and exclusions to remove things that should be in the filing. So if a paragraph is part of your risk return summary, you don't want to use a continuation or exclusion to remove it from that summary. It should still appear in the tag data when you look at the IXBRL rendering. So here's an example of a situation where you would want to use an exclusion. We can see we have our tagged summary here. We don't want the page break 2 to appear, though, so it's highlighted in red. We want to remove that. We could use exclude tags to remove that. If we look on the next slide to see what our rendered view looks like after we wrap that in exclusions, you can see the number 2 is gone. It just doesn't show it in the rendered view. You're still going to see the page breaks in the interactive data viewer, or in the interactive IXBRL viewer. But when you're looking at the older style IXBRL view, which is still available, it's the interactive data view, that rendering will not include those page breaks that are being excluded. So that's an example of an exclusion. Then why would you want to use a continuation? Well, depending on how the document is styled, continuations may be required. So I've had a couple of clients that have had issues like this where they might have borders around each page break or borders around each page. If the text continues onto the next page and ends halfway through the next page, you're going to need to use continuations to stitch together paragraphs of text. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's going to cause coding errors in the facts. A lot of the other use cases for continuations I've seen more apply to gap filings, although they can be used in places of exclusion. So there's no reason you would have to use an exclusion. You could always use continuations to attach pieces of documents together and just, skip over the excluded text. It would have the same end result. So best practices with continuations and exclusions. You're going to want to use these as they're intended in the XBRL specification, and you're not going to want to use them to intentionally hide text that is required. And make sure you develop a review process to review that the text being tagged is what you intend to be tagged. The interactive data viewer is still available. It's a great resource to see what the rendered facts look like. It might not be immediately visible in the IXBRL viewer, the newer style viewer, what exclusions are in place and what continuations are in place. So looking at the older iXBRL view will make that more obvious potentially. Then we have transformations. So transformations are rules for converting text that appear in a document to a normalized value that the SEC will actually accept. Pretty much every fact you tag is going to use at least some sort of transformation. Even a number like we have here the example 3,304, that uses the transformation num.decimal to just get rid of the comma and make it 3304, because that's the value that's expected. Other common transformations like numWords sen or numWords English would transform words into numbers. So when should you avoid using transformation tags? You generally don't have to define your own transformation tags. You should be using transformations that are defined in the specification for iXBRL or the SEC's custom transformations they have available. But here is an example of a transformation. So this is using that numWords sen transformation to transform the word none into the number 0. The fact here is expecting a numeric value, so we have to give it a numeric value, but frequently you'll see it represented on the iXBRL as none. So a transformation allows you to move that over and tag it correctly. Here's another example of a transformation we have. This is just num.decimal, very basic transformation. You can see it's converting the 1,000 with a comma to a 1,000 just numeric value with no comma. This is really important. It allows us to give XBRL the values that are required. It might require, depending on how you're presenting your facts, facts be reformatted slightly, depending on the software you're using and what transformations are available. If no transformation is available, it might require you to use a hidden fact or change the format of the text. So best practices then. You're going to want to use the transformations available in the EFM or in the specified transformation registry where applicable. There are a lot of transformations available, both from the SEC and the general tax transformation registry that should handle most situations. You also want to make sure that you use transformations wherever possible to avoid putting things in the IX hidden section. So if it's possible to use a transformation to represent data, do that instead of just hiding the fact. So dimensions. I put this in here because I get a lot of questions about it. But dimensions in Inline XBRL are basically the exact same thing as there are in traditional iXBRL. They're just displayed differently. You don't see iXBRL dimensions in the standard like table format like the interactive data used to be. So the shareholder fees table is still going to be using dimensions to specify which series and class any given fact applies to, just like it used to be in traditional XBRL. So they're used the same way. Risk return is a little bit more structured than GAAP, so I just want to cover the common types of dimensions you'll see. Generally, you don't see more than these 4. Document information, document access is used to organize summaries if you want to have multiple classes but broken out into each summary by themselves. You would use legal entity access to separate summaries by series ID. Prospectus share class access is used to define the classes in a summary. And you have performance measure access to define individual performance measures within a summary. So S&P 500 or after taxes, distributions, that sort of thing. And these have been used the same way for years now. It's not changing with Inline XBRL. So let's summarize this with a couple of best practices then. You're going to want to utilize the new SEC iXBRL renderer in your review process. And Mike's going to show you more about this, but it's definitely something that you want to incorporate into your review process because it allows you to have a nice new tool to make sure you're reviewing your data correctly. You can also use any old review tools. You can compare your prior iXBRL filings or your prior XBRL filings to your inline XBRL by using that extracted instance document that's available. You also want to consider any process changes. You want to make sure you have a plan to review the new document. Make sure you update your review checklist so that you know what you're reviewing. Make sure you have a plan to review tables with dimensions, because that is updated. There's a new way to review dimensions now. And make sure you're using the iXBRL reviewer to review balance, decimals, units, and dates. Make sure you're looking at the attributes of tagged facts. So when we're moving forward with more lessons learned and best practices, one of the main considerations you want to think about is how complex is this conversion going to be? This is always a good question. I mean, the more complex you're filing, the more time you're going to need to worry about the transformation and conversion. So you're going to want to ask your software vendor you're using or your XBRL outsourcing company how much time they're going to need for this, what sort of management software they're going to need, and then you're going to need to start looking at how long that process is going to take. So with your service provider, you should discuss who's going to be responsible for this. You want to make someone responsible on your team to talk to the service provider to make sure that you understand what this transition is going to entail. You're going to have to talk to your service provider about any changes you might need to make to your current document. Some structures might not require any changes, but depending on how your document is formatted and what style you're using, you might need to make some changes. And you're going to need to review what kind of training your people are going to need in order to work with this new style. It might be as simple as just sending a document a couple of days early, or it might be as involved as learning a new method of tagging documents. And then make sure you have a plan in place to address the changes in the review process. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle for some CPE questions.
Great, Steve, thank you so much. Just trying to move my slides along here. And as we pull up the poll questions, and remember this is for those of you who are getting CPE credit or looking for CPE credit. And if you have not yet, if you did not register to get CPE credit, go ahead and respond to the questions anyway, because we can handle the administrative part of that later on and make sure you get your credit. One question that we did receive that I wanted to address to everybody really on the call is, what's the difference between the 485 BPOS and the 497? I'm not sure who wants to take that question before we jump into polls.
Hi, Michelle, this is Mike. When we get to my presentation, we're going to be looking at a 485B. So that will be a good example of a 485B pause, which is basically an annual update to a registration statement. A 497 is a supplement to that. So it can be as small as a couple of lines of text, it can be a couple of paragraphs, or it can be almost the entire 485B refiled again, but just think of it as a supplement to a 485B.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. And for those of you who do have questions, again, click on the Q&A link and we'll be able to see your questions as they come in. So I'm going to jump into the first poll question we have, which hopefully you'll see up on your screen now. Which of the following best describes continuations? Are they used to convert text that appears in a filing to a normalized value? Or second answer, used to remove page header or footer information when text spans multiple pages with a page break in between? Or is it used when two separate text blocks overlap or when text spans multiple pages with a page break in between? Which of those three answers best represents continuations? Okay, we'll take like another 30 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to close down the poll in just a second here. The correct answer is that it is used when two separate text blocks overlap or when text spans multiple pages with a page break in between. Okay, so I'm going to end that poll and we're going to go to our second poll. Okay, which of the following have changed in the XBRL instance document? Is it answer 1, detailed tagging is no longer required? Answer 2, the instance document is no longer required to be submitted as a separate document? Or is it answer 3, label requirements have changed? So which of these have changed in the instance document? Okay, we'll take another about 15 seconds or so here. All right, the correct answer is the instance document is no longer required to be submitted as a separate document. So I'm going to close down that poll. Thank you for your answers. And I am now going to turn it over to Mike Boyle from Donnelly Financial Services, also known as GFIN, who's going to take us through reviewing inline XBRL.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Steve, Guy, and Jacob. I know everyone on the call values any time we can get with the SEC, so that was really great to hear from Jacob. And welcome everyone. What I am going to be doing is walking us through some basic steps when reviewing an inline document. I'll touch on many of the topics Steve introduced, and hopefully cover everything. I'm going to be switching to a different monitor for this presentation, so I am briefly going to stop my video. I'll come back on for the Q&A. I'm going to share my screen. And this is the document we're going to be taking a look at. Now, I'm using the SEC landing page as a jumping off point, and we will come back to this at the end of the presentation, time permitting. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention is that there is nothing unique about this particular job that we're using for the demo. This could have been one of hundreds of jobs. The reason I chose this one is it's fairly recent, early July, and it's a multi-risk return filing, which will enable us to demonstrate some of the sorting and filtering capabilities that the inline viewer provides. And it's also not an ETF, so it has all the components you'd want to see in a filing. So again, we'll come back to this page at the end, touch on some of the topics Steve mentioned. This is the SEC viewer. Now, your vendor or your filing agent will have something very similar that you'll be able to use to review your data once your data has been tagged and returned to you by your vendor. And the thing I want to start with here, very basic, is you see the orange underlining. This indicates a fact which has been tagged, okay? And in this particular job, if you look over on the top right, you can see there are 410 facts. So if we click on that, that will open up the facts panel, and you can see there's 41 pages of data. You can scroll through them. You can go to the end. Now, there are a number of ways to review. The most basic would be you could click on your first fact, and then you could hit next, and it will walk you through every tagged fact in the job. And as I hit next, take note how it moves that fact to the top of the page, right? You see on your top left, the information is changing. And what you see in front of you here This is the attribute dialog box. This changes as well when we hit next. So we're currently looking at the objective heading, which you see on the top left here, and it pops up the attribute dialog box for that particular fact. So this is certainly going to provide you an accurate way of reviewing your data. And I think it's a good way, if you're brand new to the viewer, it's a good way to introduce yourself to it, to learn it. But it's really not very practical when you're in a live environment. It's plotting, it's slow, and folks working on this data need something quicker. So there are a number of ways you can do that. As I mentioned, this is a multi-risk return job. And if we go over to sections, we can see what those are. There's the Global Value Fund and the Overseas Core Fund. Now, if you're at a fund company or fund companies council, you may be responsible for reviewing a particular part of this document. So you do not need to check all 410 facts. Perhaps you're responsible for checking one of those two summaries. So if you click on More Filters and go down to Members, you can scroll down and find your two series, which are these two S numbers here. And when I click on one of these, take note on the top right here, how the number of facts goes from 410 to 204, because it's now only going to list the facts that are associated with this particular series. Let's say your responsibility is even narrower than that, and you need to check just the indexes in the AATR table. Well, what you could do is click those, and you can see your number of facts is now 8. And if we click on that, you can see what those 8 facts are. Okay, and you have that same information available for just particular classes and any other item that has been tagged. So let me close that. Now, another option here, one of the things that Steve mentioned during his presentation was hidden facts. So if you go under Data and you click Additional Items Only, you'll note that the number of facts has gone from 410 to 35. And if we click on that, one of the other things that Steve mentioned was one item that will always be a fact is your CIK, quite simply because it does not appear on your registration cover or anywhere else in the document visually, but it does have to be tagged. So that is why this is a hidden fact. If we go back and we display the other hidden facts, you'll see most of them are your bar chart values. So let's scroll down to our first bar chart. Now, unlike XBRL, where you were not sending the graphic of the bar chart to the SEC, you now are sending it. In previous traditional XBRL, you were tagging the data, and then the SEC renderer was generating the bar chart for you. Now that you are actually transmitting the bar chart, the values are already visible. So you don't need them to be visible again, but they do need to be tagged. That is why you see all of them here with an A, which again is additional information, meaning hidden data. You will see in your list an A or a D. The A is for a hidden fact. The D is for a dimension. Almost every fact in your job will have a D because everything has at least a series applied to it, which is a dimension with the exception of your DEI information. So if we were to clear this search, I'm going to click on Reset All Filters here. Go back. You can see your DEI items in the top of your fact panel do not have an A or a D, but everything else will, because now you're into your series level information. So everything will have a D. And regarding that, as you start working with the viewer, one thing to keep in mind, under menu, there is help. And one of the items under help is fact list. And in that fact list, if you scroll down, there is a very good explanation of what those respective letters are. A appears for fact. It indicates the fact is additional data, i.e. hidden. If the letter is D, the fact is tagged with dimensional information. And as you can see here, if it's a C, it's a custom tag, which there are not very many of in the risk return tagging. So a couple of different ways to navigate. Again, you can click on a fact, and then you can use the next or previous functionality, or from within your fact panel, you can say, all right, let me see, I want to see where in the job this risk lose money is. So if we click on that, that's going to scroll down there, going to bring it to the top of your screen. It's going to open the attribute dialog box. And one additional piece of functionality in the attribute dialog box is this contract expand. If the entire amount of content cannot fit, contract expand, it will open it up to show you. And if we select a larger piece of content, such as the risk narrative here, and enlarge this, you get a better sense of that. So you can see the entire fact which has been tagged. Now, one of the other things that Steve mentioned was transformations. And this job happens to have an example of it right at the outset. So the first item which is tagged in this job, your document creation date, the way the author has provided this in the HTML is like you see it here, June 25, 2021. Well, that is not an acceptable format in XBRL. It needs to be presented as you see it here. So in the attribute dialog box, when you see format, that is the transformation which Steve was describing. And you can see in this case, we're using date, month, day, year. And that is allowing the conversion of June 25th, 2021 to the XBRL acceptable 2021-06-25 fact value. One of the other items which Steve mentioned were continuations and exclusions. So if I can find some text, a paragraph which crosses pages, which we have right here. So if we start with this derivative risk paragraph, you can see it ends here and picks up here. But we have some content in between. So if we click on this and we expand it, you can see here is that paragraph, right? And you don't see any of the headers, footers, or folios in there, which is what you want. You just want the content which needs to be tagged. So this is a good example of a continuation. We want this content here to continue here. Okay, now another way to do this is, of course, this all could have been tagged. And you could go back and say, well, I want to exclude this content from what I've been tagged, from what I have tagged. So sometimes continuation and exclusion are two different ways to get to the same result. In terms of what gets tagged, same information as previously. You're starting with your investment objective, and you're ending with your performance information. No change. The taxonomy has not changed. The requirements of what to tag has not changed. Only some of the methodology has changed. So Michelle, I know we're getting tight on time. What I'll do at this point, let me jump back to the landing page. Want to touch on a couple of things that Steve mentioned, which is you are no longer transmitting your instance document. You're transmitting your schema, your calculation link base, definitions, labels, presentation. For every inline filing, you will see this. And what this is an action which is performed by the SEC. Upon receipt of your inline filing, they will extract the XBRL document, and you will see an extracted XBRL instance document on your landing page. Also, when you are looking at this, when you're looking at an as-filed document, such as we are now, very simply, when you see iXBRL at the end of your first document, you can just click on that. That will take you to the SEC viewer. So just a couple of distinctions between what you have been doing with traditional XBRL and what you are doing going forward. Michelle, did we want to keep going, or did you want to get to CPEs, or how are we on time?
We're kind of at the end of the time here, Mike, if you want to wrap up, say in 2 minutes, so that I can cover the last CPE questions, because I imagine people may have other things that they've got to run on to, but this is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are brand new to iXBRL, I think what you will find is just going in here, clicking around, will be a useful exercise. Click on the fact panel, go find a tag you want to investigate, click on it. That's one way to move around. Look at what you see in the attribute dialog box. There, you can review your tag. You can review the value that's being tagged. Again, if there's a transformation applied, which in this case there is, you will see what transformation that was. Footnotes. If there's a footnote, you will see that here as well. So just experiment with, with clicking on facts, with the navigation, try different filters, and I think you'll find this is a very efficient tool to use for your review. My last thought is, if you're coming from the XBRL world and you've been doing this for a number of years, you really want to focus on your vendor's iXBRL viewer to review your data. Yes, you can still look at traditional XBRL, It is part of the filing, as you see here, but everything the SEC is doing now is moving toward IXBRL. So your time is best spent learning this, and I think after a short while you'll find it very user friendly. So, okay, Michelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. Okay, we're going to quickly go through a couple more CPE questions. And bear with me 1 second here. All right. Okay, so hopefully you can see the CPE question. Small fund compliance date for inline XBRL per the SEC rule begin with registration statements effective on or after which date? Is it September 17th, 2020, September 17th, 2021, or September 17th, 2022? So again, click on the link that you think is most appropriate, and we'll close this poll down in another 30 seconds or so and go to our final poll question. Okay, just like another 10 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to end the polling now. And the correct answer was 2021. So it is this year. So, and now I'm going to go to the last poll question. Let's see, make sure this is the one I've shown before. Sorry, bear with me a sec. Okay, which of the following best describes continuations? It's used to convert text. Oh, I think I've actually shown this one before, so I apologize. Let me. Zoom has changed its structure a little bit, and okay, here we go. When should filers avoid hidden tags? Is the correct response number 1, do not intentionally hide data that should appear in a filing? Number 2, do not include information that does not appear in the filing? Or is it number 3, do not include hidden tags to include required facts or elements in XBRL without displaying them in the data? So when should filers avoid using hidden tags? Okay, we'll take another 15 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to close down the polling here. And the correct answer is do not intentionally hide data that should appear in the filing. So we're going to close that poll. And unfortunately, I don't think we have time for more questions. We did have one question, and I want to see if anybody here is comfortable responding to this one. In inline XBRL for mutual funds, is it compulsory to have XBRL role preview as summary role and details data role only? I'm not sure who feels comfortable responding to that question.
Michelle, I'll take that.
Sure.
And Mike, you can chime in. The way I would answer that is the SEC has enabled the use of the summary rendering and the detail rendering that we've seen in traditional XBRL since the beginning, since the inception. As Mike and Steve mentioned, utilizing the inline viewer allows you to look at your content specifically as opposed to a rendered version, as you would see in the detail and summary rendering. So we would always suggest becoming familiar with the inline rendering and the inline viewer use the detail and the summary views as a resource, but become familiar with the inline. And Mike, I don't know if you wanted to take anything else from that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Guy, is absolutely on using the inline viewer as your primary viewing tool, because everything you need is there once you get familiar with it. The summary section in the traditional XBRL is no longer required, but it is allowed. So if you keep in mind from the outset, the point of the risk return summary section was to give mutual fund filers a visual representation of what their typeset looked like, right? That visual representation is no longer needed because you're filing your HTML. So you really want to focus on the inline document for your tagging and your visual.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, for all of our attendees, and thank you so much to our speakers, Mike and Guy and Steve and Jacob Sandoval from the SEC. This session will be posted on our event page as a replay by tomorrow. And for those of you getting CPE credit, you'll be getting your certificates in the coming week or so. Thanks again, and we hope to see you on future webinars.